11 years ago, Alt Putter, my co-investigator on the project, which generated this conference, discussed how Gerald of Wales left us precious details on spoken Dutch as far west as Haverford in southern Wales in the 12th century. My lecture today will take his paper as a point of departure to discuss strategies of language communication between Dutch and English-speaking people on both sides of the North Sea, and of course, their literary representation. Since much of what has been written on the topic has focused on medieval elites of royalty and aristocracy, I'm going to be controversial and discuss the socio-linguistic evidence, such as we have it for the lower strata of society, men and women belonging to the non-elites of serfs and sailors, modest pilgrims and traders. This focus immediately throws up one major methodological issue, namely that all detail on the use of language is filtered through Latin text, miracle stories, chronicles, charters, and laws written by Christian clergy who belong to the elite. It is my contention that the snippets on language used by non-elite men and women did not find their way into Latin stories by accident, that their authors found the issue of languages important, and that we have to explain why they did so. I should warn you that most of the snippets on language use are precisely that, very brief remarks that require interpretation. I will use the shorthand of English and Dutch for the two languages that interest here, in the full knowledge that this is an oversimplification for the many subgroups of dialects spoken in England and the Low Countries. I'm really sorry, but my PowerPoint doesn't seem to respond. I beg your pardon. Okay. English and Dutch were parts of the wider group of Western Germanic. Old English was the insular form, and Dutch belonged to the large wide group of continental Old Low German. This stretched from Calais in northeastern France in a line along the French language border, taking in Brussels and Maastricht, and from there up north via Cleve to the Baltic coast. Within the Old Germanic linguistic world, the area of Maastricht, Aachen, Keulen, and Luik, that is Aachen, Cologne, and Liège, is important because the Maas-Rhine triangle concerns three language borders: Old Low Dutch, Old Low German, and French. As Hendrik, I'm really sorry about this.
Take your time, just take your time, Lisbeth.
So within the Old Germanic linguistic world, the area of Maastricht, Aachen, Cologne, and Liège is important because the Maas-Rhine triangle concerns three language borders: Old Low Dutch, Old Low German, and French, as Hendrik van der Veldeke reminds us in his life of Saint Servaas, late 12th century. Hendrik was born in the middle of the 12th century near Hasselt, not far west from Maastricht, just above the area that I've circled there in red. This was the Dutch-speaking corner of the multilingual triangle he identified, where people spoke Duitse, Dutch and German, Walsh, that is Walloon or French, and Latijn or Latin. There is a further complication in the southeast of this triangle. Low German touched High German, the language of central and southern Germany. That Hendrik van der Veldeke wrote in both languages suggests that the languages were close enough for Germanic-speaking people to understand each other. For my purposes today, it is important to stress that both Old English and Low and High German dialects are more closely related to each other than both are to the Romance languages. And this raises another issue of modern scholarship. Since much of my evidence, as you will see, concerns cross-maritime contexts in the North Sea and the Channel, we come up against the prevailing argument in recent scholarship, especially proposed by Maryanne Kowaleski, that the lingua franca of the maritime world was French. Even if this is true, and I'm sure that she is right for the later Middle Ages, Anglo-Dutch spoken communication before 1200 had a recognizable place in the diverse linguistic field of the Northern Seas. According to a recent article by Marco Mostert, 2019, in the North Sea and the Baltic, there was no lingua franca before 1200. Instead, sailors and traders pragmatically used whatever language, all having roots in Western Germanic, was best known in whichever port. Bearing in mind the linguistic affinity between Old English and Old Low Germanic, a measure of mutual intelligibility might be expected, and I will give you one example of that in a minute. Anglo-Dutch linguistic exchange was a lived reality on both sides of the North Sea and Channel, even though the intensity varied from place to place. Now, my lecture is structured in two parts. The first, longest, consists of my discussion of Anglo-Dutch encounters in riverine and coastal territories, Sint Truiden in the Maas Valley in eastern Brabant, Tiel on the Waal in Gelderland, London on the Thames, and Canterbury near the Kent coast. In the second and shorter part of my paper, I will reflect on the elite Latin authors and their literary interest in language exchange, with particular reference to Anglo-Dutch. So I begin with Sint Truiden. In the corner of the Maastricht-Cologne-Liège triangle, signaled by Hendrik van der Veldeke, we find the Abbey of Sint Truiden. In 1095, a charter was written recording a neglected story of Anglo-Dutch relations. It is well known for the details of servitude and military service, but it has never been the subject of a study to the languages used. Its contents are as follows. An unnamed serf of Halmaal, an estate of Sint Truiden, had spent some time in England before he returned home. During his absence, he had married a free English woman called Odegena, with whom he had several free sons. Servitude or freedom descends in the female line. What had prompted the Sint Truiden man to go to England in the first place is unknown. A reference to military service, to which I return in a minute, has been taken as an indication that the serf may have left Sint Truiden in order to become a mercenary soldier, and that his profession brought him to post-conquest England. And Hanshoff even went so far as to postulate that he had taken part in the normal conquest of England. Now, the charter records that he went on legitimate business, for he is described as having left in a friendly and honorable manner, benigne et honeste. And this is important as he was clearly not a fugitive peasant. I suggest that we link his departure in the mid-1080s, perhaps as a bodyguard, with the exile of a group of Sint Truiden monks to England. Several decades later, 1114, 1115, Abbot Rudolf of Sint Truiden, the Abbey's chronicler, gave as reason for the exile a series of contested abbatial elections of Abbots Lanzo, Luipo, Herman I, and Herman II. The monastic community, he explained, went into exile and scattered far and wide to Flanders, England, Denmark, Saxony, and Germany, all I know Germanic-speaking areas. Incidentally, also precisely the places mentioned by Hendrik van der Veldeke in his Life of Sint Servaas. Then he boasted that Maastricht on the Meuse enjoyed shipping links from England to Hungary, from Saxony to France, to Denmark and Norway. The monks of Sint Truiden, traveling to England, almost certainly sought the support from their compatriot, Guizot, Bishop of Wells, 1061 to 1088, who was a native of Sint Truiden. The serf's return by 1095 may have prompted may have been prompted by Bishop Guizot's successor, the Francophone John de Filula, a medic from Tours and royal chaplain, who in 1088 had become Bishop of Wells and in 1080 had moved to sea from Wells to Bath, having bought the city and Abbey of St. Peter from King William Rufus. The Serf's family return, the family came back to calmer circumstances at Sint Truiden. There, Odegena and their sons submitted themselves to the abbot in an act of self-donation, a not uncommon procedure in continental Western Europe. In return for some arable and grazing land, they promised to pay 1 pence annually, and after the serf's death, 12. They were spared the fine for having married in England without the abbot's permission. If the serf refused to do military service, he had to pay 30 pence. Now, it is this reference to military service that sparked the notion that the serf had been a military man and that his trip to England had been primarily a military one. Now, what about the language question? Dutch was the native tongue at Sint Truiden, something that had caused Abbot chronicler Rodolph, himself a French speaker, much trouble when a decade after the charter was issued, he started his career as a teacher of mostly Dutch-speaking pupils. It must have been tough for the boys to be taught Latin and French. Our serf was, I presume, and here I will have to interpret, our serf was a native Dutch speaker. Odegena, a free English woman, was Anglophone, as were their sons. In England, the serf would have learned English, which I presume was the family's home language. We don't know how the serf earned a living. If he received a job via Bishop Guizot in his new Anglo-Norman environment, he may also have needed to learn a bit of French, if he didn't already know some, because after all, Sint Truiden is very near the language border with French-speaking territory. In the run-up to their return to Brabant, the father may have taught his son and wife some Dutch to ease them into their new life in Dutch-speaking Brabant. The charter itself refers to the self-donation agreement as one that was written down, literata pactione, itself an indication that the agreement had first been agreed orally, presumably in a combination of Dutch on the part of the abbot and English on the part of Odegena and her sons. And of course, the serf may have acted as an interpreter. Staying with the issues, Staying with the issue of language at Sint Truiden, two of the charter's witnesses, that is, witnesses of the charter of 1095, throw up surprises. Amongst the monks was one Stepelinus, whose name derives from Steppo, a Dutch name. We know from Abbot Rolof's chronicle that he had entered Sint Truiden as an oblate in around 1023. But when in the mid-1080s, the troubles, which I have already referred to, broke out, Stepelinus sought refuge at St. Bavo in Ghent, which was Dutch-speaking. After his return home, he composed an account of the miracles of the monastery's patron saint, Sint Truiden. His apograph is now in London in British Library, manuscript additional 16974, of which you here see folio 124, which contains a seafaring miracle. Sailors on a return trip from England suffered very bad weather. They got lost, became stranded in pagan lands, probably Norway, and from there found shelter in Denmark before returning home. Note again the link of England with Norway and Denmark and indirectly the Low Countries. Since they were saved by invoking the help of Sint Truiden, it is likely that the sailors came from that town, but they could also have come from elsewhere in Flanders. We may just wonder whether the serf and his English wife and sons had been on that boat that suffered such a dreadful crossing. Now, the second witness to the 1095 charter I want to draw your attention to was one Gerard Harde Knut, described by Abbot Rodolph in his chronicle as a nobilis who had married a local woman called Bertha, who had an estate at Runkelen. Gerard's second name, Hartheknut, is a royal Danish name, well known in England as the name as King Knut's son Hartheknut, briefly King of England, 1040 to 1042, but otherwise not very common. So, for example, in Domesday Book, there are only 2 references to. Outside Denmark, the name is exceptionally rare. So how did Gerard Hartheknut end up in Sint Truiden? Gerard Hartheknut's double name suggests an original Danish name, Hartheknut, linked to a Christian baptismal name, Gerard, in the same way as we find such doubling of a pagan Scandinavian and Christian Frankish names in early Scandinavian Normandy. Does Gerard Hartheknut represent a link with England or with Denmark? If England, potentially linked with Bishop Guizo of Wells, our native of Sint Truiden. So the story of our unnamed serf, his English wife and their sons, alongside Gerard Hartheknut, puts flesh on the bones of migrants in eastern Brabant, whose native tongues were English and perhaps Old Norse, if he was Danish. Their presence throws new light too on the reverse migration of Old Low German speakers from northern Lotharingia to England, such as the many clergymen who from 1040 took service with King Edward. And I'll come back to this at the end of my lecture. Now, compared to Sint Truiden's proximity to the trilingual Maas Rhine Valley, where Dutch, German, and French were spoken and written, the harbour of Tiel on the River Waal, a tributary of the Rhine, further north, was predominantly monolingual. The Dutch-speaking inhabitants flourished in trade in the 10th and 11th century, before, around the middle of the 12th century, the decline set in. As the westernmost imperial toll since 896, the German King Emperor had his agents in town, Old Low German speakers. That we can add English to this mix, we know from one of the earliest Dutch chroniclers, confusingly known as Albertus of Metz, due to a spell in that town. Albertus, a Dutch-born and is presumably a native speaker, was a monk at the monastery of Hohorst near Amersfoort, not far from Tiel. His earliest work, The Miracles of St. Walburgus of Tiel, dates from around 1022 and was dedicated to Bishop Adalbero of Utrecht. The first miracle story is Albertus's eyewitness account of the exorcism of an Englishman at Tiel. An unnamed English soldier employed by a ship merchant had gone mad in town and could only be barely controlled. For his own safety, he was bound up, so Albertus explains, I quote, in a cow's hide, which the Brits call a hudezaak. I beg your pardon, sorry, this is the correct, but I repeat this. For his own safety, the sailor was bound up, so Albertus explains, in a cow's hide, which the Brits call a hudezaak. In both Old English and Old Dutch, the word for cow's hide, hudenzaak, was the same, and therefore mutually intelligible for an English and a Dutch audience. And I thank Ad Putter for his help with this passage. That our Dutch author felt that he had to explain the word hudenzaak indicates that this audience, including Bishop Adalbero, included non-Dutch and non-English speakers. Given that Albertus had witnessed the subsequent recovery of the English sailor, we may guess that he had had a word with him and with his boss to a certain effect, as hagiographers used to do. Did he speak with the sailor or his boss in English or Dutch or perhaps German, or were their own languages mutually intelligible? We don't know. In his better known chronicle, De diversitate tempora, written probably slightly later, Albertus was full of praise about the town of Tiel, but he characterized its traders as habitual moaners about the imperial toll, which they feared would harm trade with that island, England, and prevent the return of English traders to Tiel. Albertus also despised the merchants of Tiel for their womanizing, drinking, and general unreliability. But we have, of course, to remember that Albertus was a monk. He might have had in mind his Dutch compatriots, though we must not forget that the merchants' hall regularly welcomed foreigners, including English traders. Whether the trader who had employed the mad sailor was English or Dutch remains unrecorded, but enough multilingual skill was available in the Tiel community to provide an intelligible context for the Hudensack story. As we shall see, close trading contacts between Tiel and England persisted well into the 12th century. Now, similar miracle stories about cross-maritime encounters of sailors and traders came from other Low Countries hagiographers. Abbot Herman of Tournai, Doornik, gave us the famous story about the sea crossing of canons of Laon for a fundraising mission in England in 1113. One of them, Robert, he said knew English and was able to converse with Coldestan, the English skipper of the boat, when they were attacked by pirates. Other passengers on board were Flemish merchants with 300 marks in cash. During the pirate attack, they promised this money to the Laon canons, but they reneged on their promise when the pirates retreated, and in due course, the wool that they had bought with the cash went up in flames. Now, the story presupposes various languages being spoken: French, most of the Laon canons, English, the sailors, and Dutch or French, the Flemish merchants. From the monastery of Jean Blou and Bluers, and now we go back to the area that we encountered earlier, the triangle between the Maas and the Rhine. The monastery was dedicated to Saint Guibert or Wigbert. The miracle story concerns English merchants who, during a crossing to England, fell into conversation with Hethelinus from Jean Blou, who was traveling to England on business. Upon embarkation, Hethelinus' horse had been so badly wounded that it lost a lot of blood. Without a remedy at hand, the English were astounded when Hethelinus addressed his prayers to Saint Wigbert, resulting in the horse's recovery. The language of the conversation, again, is not specified. It could be English or French or Dutch or a mixture of those. From the Low Countries, I now move across the North Sea to post-conquest London, and from miracle stories, I go to legal texts. The list of tolls, known as 4 Ethelred, has recently compellingly been redated by Rory Naismith from the time of King Ethelred, the beginning of the 11th century, to the post-conquest decades leading up to 1100. The list of tolls payable in London is important because of its grouping of foreign merchants, each paying different amounts of toll. It distinguishes between the men of Rouen, the men from Flanders, Ponthieu, Normandy, apart from Rouen, and the Ile-de-France, the men from Huy, Luik and Nivelles, that is Huy, Liège and Nivelles, and the men from the emperor, the homines imperatoris. All were francophone, except for those from Flanders and Huy, Liège and Nivelles, which were bilingual Dutch and French, while the men of the emperor were either Dutch or German speakers. A second London source gives more details about the latter group, the German emperor's men. Datable to circa 1130, the text has survived in a French copy from the time of King John, in London, additional 14252. The London port officials regulated the arrival and stay of foreign merchants from Lower Lotharingia, or the men of the emperor, les hommes liant faveur. They were mostly merchants from Cologne or Regensburg, Old German speakers, but interestingly, some of the exceptions concern Dutch-speaking men from Antwerp and Tiel, the latter comprising the merchants so detested by Albertus of Metz. According to paragraph 11, the men from Tiel, Bremen and Antwerp, Old Low German speakers, were excluded from the permission to lodge anywhere within the walls of London. They were not allowed to pass London Bridge unless they be ruled by the custom of London. The formulation suggests tension between the City of London officers, at this time presumably bilingual Anglo-French speakers, and the Dutch and German-speaking group, who, unless they submitted to the custom of London, had to stay on their ships. In terms of language, one further interesting detail in this set of regulations is that when the merchants approached London and arrived near Newware, they were permitted to sell whatever liquid they liked, a reference presumably to wine. To sell their drinks, they had to raise their standard as a means of identification and sing the Kyrie eleison up to London Bridge, according to the old law. Now, the singing of a liturgical chant from the Latin Mass was presumably enough proof for the London port officials to identify the singing traders as Christian traders of goodwill. The reference to the old law must be going back to the time of Ethelred, when England was under constant attack of pagan Vikings, who were assumed to be ignorant of the Kyrie eleison. All this suggests that in the 11th and early 12th century, despite intensive trading contacts, the identity and reputation of the German and Dutch-speaking traders made them difficult to distinguish from their Scandinavian colleagues, who until recently had been considered pirates. If the dating of around 1130, the reign of Henry I, is anything to go by, the political tension with Flanders, where Henry's nephew William Clito had recently ruled as count, much to Henry's annoyance, may well be the reason for suspicion of Dutch-speaking merchants. The omission of a similar requirement for Romance-speaking merchants suggests that the Londoners took their Christian faith and morality for granted. Leaving London and legal text, I will continue on the English side with Canterbury, but return to miracle stories. A prominent site for multilingual exchange, including Dutch, was the shrine of Archbishop Becket in Canterbury. After his murder in December 1170, Becket's cult spread so rapidly that within a decade, two monks of Canterbury, Benedict and William, wrote up his miracles. And these are fascinating stories, which, among other things, throw some light on multilingual matters. Explicit information about the languages spoken comes from a miracle story concerning Gerard from Luik, situated about 15 miles south of Maastricht, in Hendrik van der Veldeke's multilingual triangle I referred to earlier. In a dream, he had been encouraged to speak French, Romanum linguam. Waking up, he found himself able to speak the language so fluently that from that moment, he could not only speak Latin, but also French and Teutonice, which means either German or Dutch. And in this case, I am inclined to think that it was probably Dutch. Clearly, he was a literate clerk with Latin who seemingly had acquired French overnight, alongside his vernacular Dutch, perhaps German language. Stories about miraculous multilingualism are not uncommon in hagiography. Stepelinus of Sint Truiden, whom we encountered earlier, witnessed a miracle of a deaf and mute young man who, through the intercession of Sint Truiden, regained his speech not only in Dutch, and this is definitely Dutch, but also in French, Latin, and Greek. Now, the case of Gerard of Luik may be an instance of bilingual aphasia brought on by head injury, whereby one language becomes the dominant one with the other language temporarily out of action. There's no medical evidence, as far as I know, that a person can suddenly speak a language that they did not previously know, however rudimentary. Another Gerard, this one from Stamford in Flanders, visited the Canterbury shrine twice. The second time blaspheming St. Thomas, as the cure he thought he experienced the first time proved a false one. William the hagiographer excused his foul Dutch language on the grounds that he was so distressed that he was not responsible for his utterings. Along similar lines goes the story concerning two Dutch women, Dutch-speaking women from Flanders, who had come to Canterbury to thank the saint for having been healed from madness. For a fortnight, one of them, Oda, had refrained from eating, drinking, and sleeping, while the other one, who is unnamed, had for 8 years been demonically speaking alternatingly in Latin and Dutch. And this, by the way, is an interesting reference to a woman's knowledge of Latin in Flanders. In order to make sure that their miracle stories would be believed, and no doubt also to avoid any linguistical problems, pilgrims might bring props. And this is what a man from Hummerend near Utrecht did. He had lost his pigeon, perhaps a postal pigeon, and brought a replica in wax, decorated with feathers of the dead bird, to help explain the seriousness of his loss. Fortunately, he acquired a live replacement. Now, Utrecht was a bilingual town where increasingly French dominated. The fact that the man brought a replica pigeon to Canterbury might suggest that the man was primarily Dutch-speaking and not anticipating the presence of French speakers about 100 years after the Norman conquest. As for the wider area of the Low Countries, one pilgrim had come from Holland. He was crippled and had come to Canterbury to seek recovery. While there, he told the monks that his country had recently suffered a severe flood, during which several men, women, and children survived drowning, having been saved by their prayers, might we suggest in Dutch, to Thomas Becket. Unless the man knew either French or English, his native tongue Dutch must have been translated by an interpreter. Unless again, and here we come up to the problem of mutual intelligibility between English and Dutch. Now, no major Dutch flooding is known from the early 1117, though enough local floods could account for a story like this. Now, in the light of our discussion yesterday about elite women acting as intercessors for quite low-ranking, socially quite low-ranking people, I now move briefly from Canterbury to Folkestone for a story that we know from a chronicle from Gien in Flanders. In the wake of elite cross-maritime marriages between English and Low Countries men and women, we find the odd snippet of newcomers and their interaction with low-born indigenous subjects. One of them is Countess Emma of Gien, who was the widow of Nigel of Folkestone, who, after her widowhood, remarried the Count of Gien, Manasses II. And Lambert of Ardres tells a story of her as intercessor for a free peasant woman called Avis, who wished to marry a kolfkerel. And this is a story about the kolverkerlie tax, that apparently at the time was still raised by the Count of Guin. And my interest in this story, this extremely well known, is how Avisa, in an area that was Dutch speaking, would have conversed with Emma, the Countess of Guin. Now, since Emma married the Count of Guin round about 1107, we don't know when this story took place, but having lived in Guin for at least 25 years before her death, my assumption is that she learned Dutch, and that therefore Avisa, who asked for the Countess's intercession not to marry the Colfer-Kerlia tax, because she wasn't an unfree peasant, conversed with her in Dutch. Now, it is perfectly possible, of course, that Avisa, a Dutch-speaking woman from Guin, needed an intermediary to address Emma, Countess of Guin. But we have evidence from William of Ardres, from the Chronicon Andrense, whereby William of Ardres explicitly explains that round about 1200 at least, Guin and Ardres were still areas where Dutch was being spoken at the fortnightly court sessions of the Count. And he adds to that on 2 occasions that Emma was present with her husband Manasses when charters were read out and land transactions were being conducted in Dutch. So this as an illustration that elite women who married into another language territory had to acquire the native language in order to act as an intercessor for their husbands. Now, I now turn to the second and final part of my paper. This is basically a section by way of what conclusions we can draw about the literary context in which these stories take place. The first point I want to make is that in the documentary sources, we have seen the Charter of Sint Truiden and the City of London customary texts, that there is no explicit reference to the languages that are being spoken by the people who are being listed, who have to adhere to the rules they describe. So the assumption is, I think, that they spoke different languages, but we have to fill in the speaking of different languages ourselves. They were written for a contemporary audience that knew that someone who came from England almost certainly spoke either English or French, and that people from the Low Countries, as well as men of the emperor, would be speaking either German or Dutch. But the authors of these texts leave blanks in the information they contain about the linguistic communication between people of different languages. And we have to fill in the blanks as to what we think they spoke. Now, as for the narrative sources, which, as we have seen, were mostly miracle stories that I have used, we can say a little bit more. And the first thing that, of course, is very obvious is that all the authors of the text that I have used were bilingual. Albertus of Metz knew Dutch and German, perhaps a smattering of English, considering his Huzezaak story. Stapelinus of Sint Truiden knew Dutch, perhaps some French. The Anonymous of Chamblou almost certainly knew French and Dutch. The same applies to Herman of Tournai and Lambert of Ardres, because they lived so close on to the language border. Given that these authors also wrote in Latin, they were clearly trilingual. Now, what I think is very important is that the fact that they were multilingual, these authors, might have given them a special interest in stories about people who had to communicate in other languages. So what does this mean for the representation of the oral communication of the non-elite men and women they wrote about? For the hagiographer monks, some answers can be given. Their reportage of miracles about divine intervention offered them an opportunity to enhance their story's truthfulness by drawing attention to the linguistic skills, and as a manifestation of God's creation. Before God's eyes, all Christians were equal. So there was a place in the miracle stories to draw attention to non-elites with the linguistic skills. Serfs such as the unnamed one of Sint Truiden in Brabant, the sailors and traders in Tiel and London, as well as pilgrims in Canterbury, are shown to be worthy of God's grace despite their modest social backgrounds. Where the authors are explicit about meanings of words in more than one language, or about people speaking more than one language, something must have prompted them to do so. Similarities in vocabulary between the different languages, especially unexpected ones, even beyond the languages they knew themselves, might have been one such prompt, such as the Hudezaak incident in Tiel. Perhaps the moral message attached to the recovery of the sick English sailor attacked by the devil but then exorcised was a manifestation of God's intervention. The call for Carolee episode in Guienne involves a potential cause for social upheaval amongst the peasants, which warranted the free peasant woman to seek support from the multilingual countess to help resolve a volatile political situation. The miracles at Canterbury and Sint Truiden involve spontaneous new linguistic skills, also recorded the manifestation of divine grace. Implicitly, these miracles attest to the skills needed to speak more than just one birth language. God bestowed a new language skill as a reward for good behavior. Think of the poor Dutch-speaking clerk from Liège who overnight became fluent in French, or the Flemish woman who cursed in Latin and Dutch, both wonders attested by learned monks at Thomas Becket's shrine in Canterbury. Another answer is the fact that the serfs, soldiers, and traders, and indeed pilgrims, were important conduits for the spread of the saints' cults. The Anonymous of Jan Bloem said as much when the English merchants, amazed by the recovery of Hethelina's wounded horse, promised to tell the tale of its miraculous recovery wherever they would go, including England. Adalbertus of Metz may have hated the Tiel traders, English and Dutch, but he needed them to spread the word of the cult of St. Walburgis in Tiel that he was promoting. Perhaps he had an English audience in mind when he pointed out the similarities between Hudezaak and Huidenzaak as a means of persuading them to come to Tiel, despite the high tolls of the German emperor. Elite's benefactors were a target audience for big money. The non-elite believers were important for spreading the news of cults abroad in foreign fields. And if the non-elite men and women had difficulties overcoming language barriers, they were provided with interpreters. The most explicit evidence on the use of interpreters comes from the hagiographer William of Canterbury himself, who remarked that so many pilgrims arrived at Thomas Becket's shrine with tales about healing that they were very difficult to verify due to the languages in which they were recounted and which he could not understand, including Dutch. He continued, for them, the pilgrims, the martyr Thomas Becket, customarily provided interpreters as suitable witnesses if the need arose. This is evidence that interpreters were used to translate stories into English, French, to enable verification of healings and assess the story's veracity. Benedict and William knew that lowering potential linguistic thresholds might stimulate even more visitors to Becket's shrine. Pilgrims would spread the word about Becket abroad, and neighboring Flanders was clearly an obvious target. There was a Flemish quarter in Canterbury, so interpreters for Dutch would not be difficult to find. Since the Norman conquest of England, interpreters were used in England between the Francophone newcomers and the indigenous population. The surname Latimer suggests that the profession of interpreters ran in families. However, most interpreting, if it happened, was done informally. And here we think, of course, of the Serf of Sint Truiden, who might have acted as an interpreter for his wife and sons. Now, the final reason why the miracle stories written by the elite Latin authors are so important for modern scholarship on Anglo-Dutch relations lies in the fact that they align with the evidence of the trade regulations, especially for London, something that cannot be stressed enough. Furthermore, they provide additional evidence for the importance of the Maas-Rhine triangle, both in terms of trade and in terms of cultural literary contacts. Whereas Anglo-Flemish migration is very well known, and we will hear more about this afternoon, the Eastern Brabant links have been underexplored for the period before 1200. Surely the post-1040 Lotharingian clerical migration to England in the following of King Edward the Confessor, who had lived a life of exile in Normandy, has been long known. I've drawn attention to Guizot of Sint Truiden, who was Edward's royal chapel and then became bishop. And Guizot was one of 8 clergy, all drawn from the same area. Crucially, despite all the research that has been done in these people, no research has been done to the extent to which their linguistic skills were a stimulus for this migratory move. The Norman conquest accelerated the elite clerical migration, as is evidenced in the current research on Doomsday Book, which Stephen Baxter has recently characterized as truly European because of the scribal skills, because of the scribes that migrated from Lotharingia to England to help with the preparatory documents for Doomsday Book. However, from my perspective today, it's crucial to stress that non-elite lay migration and trade predated the clerical migration from Lotharingia to England. And more importantly, that we can detect a countermove of non-elite English men and women as we found them in Tiel and Sint Truiden. They came with foreign languages. And this brings me back to the start of my paper, and I'm concluding, where I drew attention to Gerald of Wales's 12th century reports on Dutch-speaking people as far west as Wales. This information is well known. Less well known up to today is that the Serf from Sint Truiden, his English wives and their bilingual sons, turned Halmaal in eastern Brabant, in the easternmost sites in the Low Countries, where earlier in the late 12th century, English was spoken. Thank you.